Long before the United States became a global superpower, it was already casting its gaze far beyond its borders. In the decades before the Civil War, American ships sailed to the farthest corners of the globe to protect and expand commerce, to project political power and religious influence, and stake out a place in a European-dominated global order. This was a period when young American sailors and naval officers carried the ambitions of the rising republic into unfamiliar waters and foreign lands, helping to shape U.S. foreign relations in a way that has often been overshadowed by the nation's internal conflicts during this period. What did this early outward engagement look like? How did these expeditions reflect the hopes and anxieties of a growing nation? And what can they tell us about the ways in which Americans viewed the world? I'm Jean Badgelan, and you're listening to Talking History. Joining us today to talk about this fascinating topic is historian Michael Verney, author of A Great and Rising Nation, Naval Exploration and Global Empire in the Early U.S. Republic, published by Chicago University Press in 2022. Dr. Verney teaches at Drury University. His work explores the global history of the early U.S. Republic with a focus on maritime expansion, encounters, and empire. Dr. Verney, welcome to Talking History.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Love your podcast and excited to have this conversation.
Well, thank you for joining us today. So I want to get straight to the topic. So when we think of America and the world, we usually think of it as a post-Civil War development or even something that happens at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But your work focus is specifically on America and the world during the early Republic. That is the period, from the American Revolution right down to the Civil War. So kind of what I want to start with here is, could you talk a little bit about how you came to study this kind of more obscure topic?
Sure. That's a great opening question, Gene. And I really, once again, appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. The kind of American history that I grew up with seemed very isolated. It was almost as if the early national United States was on a plateau that was raised up above the rest of the world. And particularly, I was early fascinated in all kinds of histories, but the history of early America, particularly the pre-Civil War period, really fascinated me. But as you noted, a lot of the traditional scholarship, the way that Americans have traditionally thought about that period, is very internally focused. It's focused on, the coming conflict of the Civil War in many ways. And that was the kind of history that I got regarding the United States in grade school and high school. When I went to historic sites and parks, that was sort of the narrative that was told. And for that reason, what I sort of found is some of my earliest passions for history was actually in the area of the ancient world and world history and European history, partly because they were just so dynamic and they were almost the opposite. They were firmly embedded in the world. These were nations and empires that were interacting with other peoples that had imperial encounters around the world. And I found that really interesting. I was also interested in maritime history, particularly sort of America and the sea. But even that, in sort of the early way that I encountered it, seemed somewhat isolated. So if you've ever seen any of the wonderful paintings by Winslow Homer of the late 19th century, he does these great images of sort of man against the sea or the idyllic sort of pastimes of being at sea. And that was what I sort of associated with maritime history. And it was for that reason that actually I was by really the 3/4 of my early career in college, I was thinking I was going to go into ancient history. I was getting a minor in Latin language and literature, and I was really gearing up for that sort of area of specialization. But then what happened is midway through college, my parents moved from Western Massachusetts to Cape Cod, to Wellfleet, and we did a family trip on a ferry from Hyannis in southern Massachusetts, southern Cape Cod, to Nantucket. In August of 2007. And Nantucket, of course, has this great storied history, particularly around whaling, but other areas as well. And we visited the Nantucket Whaling Museum. And I was enjoying that museum quite a bit. I really was interested in whaling. I enjoyed looking at all the barrels and the harpoons and the skeleton of a sperm whale that was displayed. But it was when I got to the second story of this museum, I came across an exhibit that was called Souvenirs. And what was on display there were all of these artifacts from Oceania. There were clubs, there were paddles, there was a set of sharkskin armor, and then in particular, there was what was identified and described as a ceremonial throne. And really, it was a fairly humble but beautiful artifact. It looked somewhat like a small one-person bench, curved, and then with 4 pillars to it. But the plaque really captivated me because the plaque had a story, and the story was, as it said, a Polynesian chief in Tahiti, or the Society Islands as they knew it at the time, had given this to a Captain Gardner of Nantucket in 1842. And that was all that was there, but that moment really captured my attention. It riveted me. I wanted to know what that moment was like. I wanted to be there. What had prompted this Tahitian noble to give this throne to this Nantucket whaling captain? And I was captured not only in sort of the moment, but the meeting of these two very different cultures, this Quaker whaling captain and this Oceanian society. So seeing this throne really broke the paradigm that I had about American history. In some ways, it was like a paradigm shift moment, that actually there's this really dynamic, outwardly looking story of American mariners voyaging around the world, having all these various encounters. And here was something that I could really get into and sink my teeth into. So that's how I really got into it. I finished my minor in Latin at UMass Amherst. I continue to torture my students about etymology, but nonetheless, my career took a very different angle from that moment.
So I want to kind of talk a little bit now about how you frame this American encounter with the world during the early Republican period. So you make a distinction between what we might call foreign policy and foreign relations. Why do you make that distinction, and how does that help us understand the way in which Americans engaged with the world, especially in an era, and I think this is very important for our listeners to understand, before instantaneous communication. So we have, in the middle of the 19th century, the development of the telegraph system. And of course, the telegraph system, takes a little bit of time to spread around the globe. So before this period, you have Americans traveling around the world, but there's no way to contact home. So this is a very different world from, let's say, the American empire that emerges in the late 19th and early 20th century, where they have telegraph systems, rapid communications, telephones, later on radios, etc. This is a completely different world in many ways.
Oh, it is. Yeah, very much. So for your first question, the distinction between foreign policy and foreign relations, foreign policy tends to sort of be associated with policymakers in the executive department, the president, secretaries of state, secretary of the Navy, to an extent, other members of the cabinet, various ministers to Europe, et cetera. And those characters are really important. They're important in my research. They show up a lot. But nonetheless, that's really kind of restricted to the State Department. And the State Department was actually quite tiny in many ways in the early republic. And even the State Department itself relied heavily on non-state actors to be able to understand the world. And so, for example, there's a new book out called Missionary Diplomacy by Emily Conroy Krutz that shows that presidents and secretaries of state were relying on missionaries in the 19th century very heavily to understand, particularly the non-European world. And so why I personally prefer foreign relations is the plurality is really important. Because there's not one U.S. foreign policy, there's many foreign policies. And these are being sort of acted upon by all kinds of actors, some of whom are state actors, others are non-state actors. In terms of, looking at this, what we see when we look at sort of a broader tapestry of U.S. foreign relations is that we have merchant mariners who are voyaging around the world looking for profit. We have ordinary working class sailors who have their own interactions with people abroad. We have, of course, whalers and other kinds of fishermen around the world. We have missionaries who want to spread what they called the Great Savior's Empire around the world. And each of these different groups has a radically different orientation to the world. They have a different identity. They have a different prism, a different set of agendas. And then, of course, there's the naval officers who, as you noted, they don't have instantaneous communication with Washington. They have to go off of whatever directions they got from the beginning of their sort of voyage from the Secretary of the Navy, and then occasionally they'll get other directives, but these are pretty intermittent. So they're on the ground and they have to navigate between all these different foreign policy interests of the sailors and the merchant mariners, the missionaries. And then, of course, they have to also consider the honor and dignity of the United States and the honor and dignity of the powers that they're dealing with, although they're not always good about doing that. So they're navigating this very complex dynamic. And in terms of sort of my work, to frame it sort of historiographically, there were previous generations of historians who had looked at, of course, whaling captains and naval officers abroad, but they tended to be fairly prosaic and sort of lay out the bare facts and the narrative, that they were the pioneers who had to sort of map out this world. But that meant that oftentimes there's almost two plateaus. I described the earlier plateau of sort of the domestically focused U.S., and then there's almost another plateau that these roving sailors and maritime actors are not necessarily deeply embedded in U.S. society and culture and politics. And that's one of the things that I try to do, and I'm sort of part of a group of historians, Brian Rouleau and Dane Morrison and Roger Bailey among them, who are really trying to embed these global actors more in the nation story and make sure that we understand their prism, their values, et cetera. So anyhow, that's why I prefer the term foreign relations, because it's much more inclusive and dynamic, I think, than simply foreign policy.
And in terms of, these naval officers operating, I'm assuming here then, when it comes to the actual creation of what we might call sort of more specifically foreign policy, these officers actually have, compared to, let's say, officers later on in American history, an enormous amount of sort of leeway in the way that they operate. Are they, for example, making agreements and then having them sort of ratified by the U.S. government afterwards? Are there contradictions emerging in what a naval officer might, say to a Tahitian nobleman, and then suddenly the officials back in Washington are saying, no, that's not what we wanted as a foreign policy. It seems like this situation would be a kind of recipe for a lot of confusion, because there's no way for these officers to communicate with headquarters. It takes them, 6 months, a year to get back, and then a year to get back to the Pacific Ocean. So, what kind of difficulties are we talking about during this period because of the communications issue?
Yeah, that's great. There's huge difficulties. I mean, these officers have to be able to think carefully about what they are expected to do and what would be an overstep of their authority in ways that would really be detrimental to their career. So, they can be pretty brash. They can be pretty touchy in terms of their honor. And sometimes those things, including national honor, those things kind of set them off, and they can end up going on fairly bloody, inhumane rampages, particularly against, societies that, would have been considered quote unquote savage in this period. As far as treaties go, they do make lots of agreements with native polities in the Pacific world. But here there's kind of a parallel with what's happening on the North American continent, where just kind of like Army officers, naval officers are making these agreements with indigenous societies, and only some of them are being ratified by the Senate. And particularly Oceania, a lot of them are not being ratified. But nonetheless, they are seen as being legally binding, despite the fact that technically under the Constitution, the Senate's supposed to ratify them. A distinction can be made, though, with polities that were considered higher in the scale of civilization. And this is all a European construct that goes back to the Age of Enlightenment, whereby human societies, it was believed, progressed through various stages, beginning with so-called sort of savagery, a closeness to nature, moving up into what's called barbarism, sort of half civilization. I know you're very familiar with all these ideas. And then finally, full civilization, but of course that's a very narrow definition. It's by European standards. And so naval officers, they have this belief, and it means that they're going to interact with these societies very differently, depending upon whether they see them as being quote unquote savage or quote unquote barbaric or half civilized is sometimes another term that's used. So, for example, we'll talk about, I think, Commodore Perry's mission to Japan later, but when he goes to Japan, the perception that Americans have is Japan is really on the half civilized or kind of like China. So therefore, the Treaty of Kanagawa, which I'm sure we'll get to, that is actually ratified by the U.S. Senate, and sent back to Japan. There's no such similar ratification for, various chieftains in Fiji.
So we basically have a situation where the kind of prejudices that exist regarding global civilization that emerge from the Enlightenment notion of human progress, affect the way that these officers are interacting with various societies. So, interacting with a chief in Fiji or in the Sandwich Islands, which would become, Hawaii, they were seen as kind of lower than dealing with one of these ancient civilizations, which was still semi-barbaric, but had some kind of parallel with European civilization. Perhaps it's kind of stuck in the medieval period as opposed to progressing. So not all native societies were viewed the same in the Pacific world during this period.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and then the other thing I might add to that's a source of tension is that the Enlightenment perspective of these different societies at different scales that can be progressed, they can be led on, and it's a very paternalistic view, but nonetheless there's both the belief and the hope of sort of kind of progress according to European or Western standards. As we get later in the period that I study, we get into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. In many ways, it begins in the 1820s. Race becomes a specter. So then the idea that maybe not all of these peoples can make progress or achieve, full status creates a tension in the way that they are undertaking their missions, and it can also inform, some of the violence that we see. That really I'll give an example that one of these the first of these U.S. Navy exploring expeditions is uncreatively called the United States Exploring Expedition. And from 1838 to 1842, it surveyed the South Pacific, the northwest coast of North America. And there's a moment where, as they're engaging in cartography, and that was the main purpose of the mission, they're charting the Fijian Islands, the Sandalwood Islands, as they used to be called. And there's a tiny island off one of the main islands called Malolo. And there's a tense negotiation over foodstuffs between a party of U.S. Navy sailors and naval officers. There's a situation where the Navy, this naval launch, has taken the son of a chief hostage to make sure that these negotiations onshore go well. There's 2 naval officers ashore. And in discussing how many yams and hogs they're going to have, violence breaks out, and 2 naval officers are killed, and something like 6 or 8 of these Fijians are killed. And the commander of the expedition responds by really leveling the whole island. He ends up killing about 100. He burns both of the main towns on the island. And really, in my mind, the only way that could be justified in his mind, and the way that he justifies it, is that they are quote unquote savage, and they are more like pirates than civilized human beings. And pirates, the reason why pirates are a threat is because they exist outside the law of nations, the community of nations. And so he sees them in a very particular racial context that he has to teach them a stern lesson. And he's going to do that through overwhelming and absolutely asymmetrical violence in response to this.
So as we head to the end of this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about your upcoming research. And I think this is a kind of good contrast to the example you just gave. So you've talked about Fiji, but your newer research is now focusing on Japan, and particularly the Perry mission of the mid-1850s. And that's probably, if there's any foreign expedition that's known to Americans before the Civil War, it's the Perry mission, the black ships, and the opening up of Japan. And of course, compared to the Fiji Islands, I'm assuming that American perceptions of Japan are very different from the peoples of Polynesia and Oceania during this period. Japan is an ancient civilization. It's a civilization which has, literacy, its own high culture. It has products, manufactured products that are in high demand. So this is a very different kind of interaction. But again, this interaction is still an unequal interaction between the Europeans and the Japanese. So can you talk a little bit about what your research on this mission is about, what direction you're taking it, and what does it kind of tell us about this period?
Yeah, great. No, I'd love to talk about that. So as you noted, listeners are probably familiar or have heard of Commodore Matthew C. Perry's Japan expedition. So Commodore Perry was tasked with signing a treaty with Japan in 1852, and he went to Japan with 4 warships in July of 1853, and very cheekily, he doesn't go to Nagasaki, which is a traditional port for foreign relations between sort of Europeans and Japan, but he tries to go as close to Edo, or modern-day Tokyo, as possible to deliver a letter from President Millard Fillmore. And there's quite a bit of terror about this, but he manages to deliver the letter, and he says he's going to be back. And of course, he's arriving at these 4 war steamers, and there's a lot of wonderful Japanese woodblock prints that really kind of shows the sense of both curiosity and wonder, but also terror of what these vessels look like.
And these are the most modern warships of the era. We've moved away from an age of pure sail towards the era of the ironclads. So this looks very different from any kind of traditional ships the Japanese have seen before.
That's right. Yeah. And these particularly, these are not ironclads quite yet, but they are steamers. So they have the funnel, they have the smoke, they have the coal, and they're really quite intimidating. And Perry, he wanted to make sure that he would have these vessels for this mission. He arrives, he returns in February of 1854, now of 7 ships, and he forces the Japanese basically at the cannon's mouth to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa in March of 1854. And the Treaty of Kanagawa did a number of things. There's a number of concerns that Americans have. One of which is the fact that there's all these commercial interests off Japanese waters. They want coal for trans-Pacific steamship lines. There's all this whaling activity. So Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, for example, he loses his leg to Moby Dick off of the coast of Japan, and that's reflective of this truth. And some of these Americans who were either shipwrecked or who sought refuge in Japan, they weren't particularly well treated. Then again, they weren't necessarily the most upstanding citizens either, to be fair. But that was another sort of major issue that prompted Perry to go to Japan. The thing that's new that I'm working on is that there is another very large U.S. Navy expedition called the North Pacific Exploring Expedition that goes to Japan right after Perry's mission. And it's massive. It's 4 ships, over 400 men and officers. It's over 8 times larger than the Lewis and Clark expedition, which Americans tend to be a lot more familiar with. And the National Archives has almost 58 manuscript volumes of ship's journals and correspondence, and logbooks that are virtually untouched. The mission of the North Pacific Expedition, or the NPE is what I call it, was to chart the coastline of Japan. And the Japanese did not want this whatsoever. But nonetheless, the commander, Lieutenant John Rogers, has this obligation. He's been tasked with his government to complete this survey. And in particular, he's using Article 10 of the Treaty of Kanagawa. And Article 10 had said that American vessels can go into any port, any Japanese port, if they're in distress or because of stress of weather. And what Rogers says to the Japanese is essentially, we need to be able to have charts of all the harbors of Japan. Otherwise, this article is completely useless. So he's really pushing this article to its fullest extent. And what's interesting about Rogers to me is that he knows that the Japanese don't want this. And he also knows that Perry's treaty was signed at the cannon's mouth. And he's very explicit about this. And he believes that pretty much all the Asian polities that have come into contact with European powers have done through gross injustice. In fact, this January, one of the things I located at the Library of Congress is his unpublished manuscript about this mission. And it's just fascinating to read. He was a very reflective person. But nonetheless, in order to complete his mission, he allowed some of his sailors and mid-ranking officers to actively beat and kick and hit with boat hooks or oars any Japanese samurai or officers, government agents that tried to stop their surveys. So you can picture this happening in sort of small boats along the coastline. And he even witnesses one of these moments. And I haven't found, despite all his expressions of sympathy and understanding the Japanese prism and notions about injustice enforced on Asian polities, he never reprimands any of his officers for this kind of activity. And what it seems to me, to go back to the earlier conversation about sort of the scale of civilization, he believes that the Japanese, by preventing foreign trade, have violated the law of nations, and therefore they cannot be held to the same protections of the law of nations. That nations, to be part of sort of the community of civilized nations, they need to engage in trade. They need to help increase the share of wealth around the world. And by violating that, therefore, this gives the U.S. Navy the right to go in and to force them to open trade. And so he's seeing it in that context. He's also seeing it that because the Japanese are not allowing them to do these surveys, they are endangering American mariners, and they're making them, he actually thinks of them as putting them beyond the pale of humanity and making war upon them, because they need, for their own survival, to have access to these ports. So therefore, the Japanese have had 2 violations against the law of nations, and therefore he does all kinds of intimidatory diplomacy like Perry did, and he also allows a limited amount of humiliating interpersonal violence because he sees those as being really important for completing his mission, and he justifies that by saying, to himself at least, that the Japanese have violated international law, and that's why we can exert a certain amount of forcefulness in completing these surveys. So he's a pretty fascinating figure. There's a lot more to talk about and a lot more characters in the mission, but that should hopefully give your listeners a taste of what I'm working on.
Well, Dr. Verney, that's all we have time for this month on Talking History, and I do hope we can have you back once you've completed your research and you have more to tell us about this fascinating expedition.
Well, thank you, Jen. That was really a pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation, and I hope to talk to you more soon.
You can catch Talking History on the first Thursday of every month after the midday news, or as a podcast available on the KSMU website or wherever you get your podcasts.